My name is Aaron Grant, and I'm probably one of the last people on Earth who still knows what it's like to age. 10 years ago, I made a decision that everyone else said was stupid. When the world was lining up to take the Revive X pill, I said no. At first, it wasn't a big deal. People thought I was being cautious, waiting to see what would happen. Smart move, my dad told me. Let everyone else be the guinea pigs. But as the months went on and the pill seemed to be working miracles, the pressure started. How could I argue with the results? People who were dying of cancer just weren't anymore. Wrinkles disappeared, grey hair turned back to black, blonde or brown, and everyone just looked better, stronger, happier. My mum, who'd been battling arthritis for years, started going on hikes. My brother Michael called me every week to brag about how great he felt. "Aaron, you're gonna love it," he'd say. "Just take the damn thing already." But I didn't. I don't even know why, not exactly. It just felt wrong. I don't know, like we were messing with something we weren't supposed to. The thing is, you don't realize how much you stand out when you don't go along with everyone else. The first time I really noticed it was at my mum's birthday party. She was turning 60, but she looked 30. My brother, still 28. Meanwhile, I was pushing 35, and you could see it. I felt it too, like I was aging in dog years, while the rest of them stayed frozen in time. Everyone was polite about it at first, but eventually they started to ask. "Are you sure, Aaron?" my mom said, handing me a slice of cake. "It's not too late, you know. You could feel like this too." I laughed it off, like always. "I'm fine, Mom, really." But I could see the disappointment in her eyes. And then things started to get weird. It was little things at first. My neighbour, Mrs. Klein, was one of the first people in our neighbourhood to take the pill. She used to be this sweet old lady who baked cookies for everyone at Christmas. After Ravivex, she looked like a middle-aged fitness model. But one morning, I saw her standing in her yard just staring at her flowers. For hours. She didn't move, not once. I thought maybe she was meditating or something, so I waved. She didn't wave back. She didn't even blink. Then there was my co-worker, Sarah. She was in her late 40s when she started taking Revivex, but you'd never know it. She looked younger than me by the end of that first year, but one day at work, I noticed she kept rubbing her wrists, like her skin was bothering her. When I asked if she was okay, she just smiled too wide and said, "Of course, never better." It didn't feel right. I started hearing other stories too. People forgetting things, important things like their kids' names or where they lived. A guy down the street started keeping his curtains closed all the time, and no one ever saw him outside anymore. Everyone brushed it off. "It's nothing," they'd say. "Stress, maybe. Adjustment period." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. And then there was Michael, my golden boy, little brother. He'd always been the smart one, the strong one, the one who did everything first. He took Revivex the day it came out, and for a while he was unstoppable. But one night I found him sitting in the dark staring at his hands like they didn't belong to him. "Mike," I said, "you okay?" He didn't look up. "Yeah, just tired, that's all." But he didn't sound tired. He sounded scared. That's when I realized something was wrong. I just didn't know how bad it was going to get. It's been 10 years since Revivex hit the market, 10 years since the world changed forever. And let me tell you, it's not the utopia everyone thought it would be. I'm 45 now. My back aches when I sit too long. My knees creak when I go up the stairs. And I've got a couple of grey hairs starting to show. Meanwhile, my brother Michael still looks like he's in his late 20s. My mom, pushing 70, could pass for my sister. But here's the thing. Something about them isn't quite right. At first I thought it was just me being bitter. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little jealous sometimes. They've got all the energy in the world, and I'm over here icing my knees after a game of pickup basketball. But the more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't just me. The Eternals, yeah, that's what they call themselves now, are different. It's not just how they look, it's how they act. Take my brother, for example. Michael was always a talker, the kind of guy who could charm anyone in the room. But these days, conversations with him feel off. He doesn't joke the way he used to, doesn't laugh the same. It's like he's going through the motions, like he's pretending to be the guy he used to be. And it's not just him. Everywhere I go, I see it. Eternal standing a little too still, smiling a little too wide, blinking just a little too slowly. It's subtle, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Then there's the way they look at people like me. Mortals, they call us. At first it was pity, like we were sad little kids who didn't know any better, but now it feels more like contempt, like we're ants crawling around their perfect little picnic. I'll never forget the day it really hit me. I was at the grocery store grabbing a carton of milk when I heard someone laughing, not just laughing, cackling. I turned around and there was this woman, maybe in her 30s, leaning over a display of apples. She was staring at them like they were the funniest thing she'd ever seen. People were staring, but no one said anything. I walked over, trying to be polite. Ma'am, you okay? She whipped around so fast I almost dropped the milk. Her eyes didn't look right, too shiny like glass. She grinned at me, teeth perfect and white, and said, "Aren't they beautiful?" I didn't know what to say. She leaned in closer, whispering like she was sharing a secret. "They don't rot anymore. Nothing does." I left my cart and walked out of the store. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The apples. The way she looked at me, the way her laugh didn't sound human. I started digging again, scrolling through the forums where other mortals like me shared stories. Most of it was the same. Little things like Eternals forgetting simple words or staring at nothing for hours. But then I found something new, a post titled Project Necrosis. It was a leaked report, supposedly from Vitellon, the company behind Revivex. The post claimed that during the early trials, some participants showed unusual biological changes. It didn't go into detail, but it mentioned things like cellular rigidity and neurological disruptions. The most chilling part, the company buried the data. They called it statistical anomalies and pushed ahead anyway. I didn't want to believe it. I mean, who would? But then I thought about Michael, about the woman in the store, about Mrs. Klein staring at her flowers. I thought about the way my mum had started forgetting little things like what day it was or where she'd put her keys. And I thought about the apples. They don't rot anymore. I used to think I was afraid of dying. Now I know better. The first time I saw it up close, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was Mrs. Klein again, my neighbour, the one who used to bake cookies for the whole block. She'd been keeping to herself lately, but one morning I saw her out in her yard. She was barefoot, wearing the same sundress she always wore, but something about her looked wrong. Her skin was peeling, not like a sunburn, worse. It was coming off in patches like dried glue, revealing something shiny underneath. I called out to her, "Mrs. Klein?" She didn't respond, just kept staring at the sun. When I walked closer, I felt my stomach turn. Her eyes weren't human anymore. They were silver, reflective, like little mirrors. She turned to me, slow and deliberate, and smiled. "Aaron," she said, her voice soft and hollow, "isn't it beautiful?" I ran. That was the day I realized the rumors were true. The forums weren't just conspiracy theories. Something was happening to the Eternals, and it was getting worse. It wasn't long before the news caught on. At first, they tried to downplay it, calling it isolated incidents and rare complications, but you can't hide something like this forever. Videos started popping up online, people with skin flaking off in chunks, their eyes turning metallic, their voices slurring into static. The worst part? They didn't seem to care. Some of them even laughed like it was a joke. Others just stood there silent as their bodies fell apart. Riots broke out when Vitellon finally admitted what was happening. They called it post-synthetic cellular adaptation, a fancy way of saying that Revivex wasn't just stopping aging, it was replacing it. Human cells weren't human anymore. They were something else, something stronger, sure, but also wrong. And then there was Michael. I'd been avoiding him for weeks, ever since I found the report on Project Necrosis. I couldn't look him in the eye without seeing what he might become. But one night, he showed up at my door. "Hey," he said, smiling like nothing was wrong. "You going to let me in or what?" I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body told me to slam the door and lock it. But he was my brother. He walked into the living room, sat down on the couch, and rubbed his hands together. "It's crazy out there, huh?" he said, nodding toward the window. "People losing their minds over nothing." "Nothing," I said. "Mike, have you seen what's happening?" He shrugged. "It's just a phase. The body adapting, that's all. They'll figure it out." I stared at him, trying to find the brother I knew in those words, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. His hands were trembling, and when he noticed me looking, he stuffed them into his pockets. "What's going on with you?" I asked. "Nothing," he snapped, too quickly. I leaned forward. "Mike, show me your hands." He didn't move. "Show me!" I said again, my voice shaking. Finally, he pulled them out of his pockets. His skin was cracked like dry clay, and underneath I could see something shiny, metallic. His fingers twitched like they weren't entirely under his control. "See?" he said, forcing a laugh. "Just a little dry skin." "Mike," I whispered, "this isn't normal. You need help." He stood up so fast I flinched. "I don't need help," he shouted. "I'm fine, Aaron. You're the one who's wrong. You're the one who's—" He stopped mid-sentence, clutching his head. "Mike!" He let out a low, guttural sound like a growl and stumbled toward the door. I have to go," he said, his voice slurring. "Don't call me. Don't." And then he was gone. That was the last time I saw him before the collapse. The streets are chaos now. Eternals are losing control faster than anyone can explain, and the mortals are fighting just to survive. Vatalon's gone silent, their headquarters burned to the ground by an angry mob. The forums are full of horror stories. People turning into statues, their bodies hardening until they can't move anymore. Others are losing their minds entirely, laughing and screaming as their humanity slips away. I don't know what's going to happen next. But I do know one thing. I'd rather die a mortal than live as whatever they've become. It began without warning. At first it seemed like another grim development in the saga of the Eternals, but this was different. Something no one could explain. I was walking downtown when I saw the first signs. A man in a sharp suit, one of the Eternals, stood frozen in the middle of the sidewalk. People walked around him, muttering complaints, until someone stopped and pointed. "Smoke," they said. It was faint at first, rising from his skin like steam off a hot road. His face twisted, not in pain but in confusion. He looked down at his hands, his expression blank as the smoke thickened. Then, without warning, his body ignited. It wasn't like a normal fire. There were no flames licking the air, no crackling wood sounds. It was quiet, eerie, as though the heat itself was burning him from within. His skin darkened, blistering and peeling, exposing muscle and sinew beneath. But he didn't scream. He didn't run. He just stood there, staring ahead like he couldn't even feel it. The crowd scattered, panicked cries echoing through the street. I ducked behind a car, heart pounding, as the man turned his head slowly, scanning the people around him. His movements were stiff, mechanical, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was barely more than a whisper. "It's happening," he said. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Eternals everywhere were reporting the same phenomenon: sudden heat, smoke, and a slow, agonizing transformation. The fires didn't consume them entirely. They left behind something worse, bodies stripped of skin, raw and exposed, with patches of hardened material glinting in the sunlight. And yet they didn't die. I saw more of them as the days passed, wandering the streets like ghosts. Their voices were hollow, their movements sluggish, but they were alive, or at least something close to it. They avoided mortals like me, their reflective eyes scanning past us as though we weren't even there. I tried to avoid them too, but then it hit home. Michael. I hadn't seen him since the night he stormed out of my house, but I'd heard rumours. People said he'd been seen downtown pacing the streets with a group of other Eternals. I didn't want to believe it, but I had to know. When I finally found him, I almost didn't recognize him. His skin was gone, replaced by something shiny and uneven, like molten metal cooled too quickly. His face was a patchwork of exposed muscle and bone, his silver eyes dimmer than I remembered. He stood in an alley, leaning against the wall, his chest rising and falling in shallow, mechanical breaths. "Mike," I said, stepping closer. He didn't respond at first. Then slowly he turned his head. "Aaron," he said, his voice rasping like wind through dry leaves. I froze. "You were right," he said, his words halting, "about all of it. We thought we could escape death, thought we could cheat nature. But this is what happens when you try to play God." "What's happening to you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked down at his hands, the edges of his fingers crumbling into ash. "We're unraveling," he said. "Our bodies can't keep up with the changes. The pill, it didn't just stop aging, it replaced it. But nothing can replace decay. Nothing can stop the end forever." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? "I can feel it," he continued. "The heat. It's constant now, like it's coming from inside me. I don't sleep, I don't eat, I just exist." He took a step forward, his body creaking like an old machine. "Aaron," he said, his voice cracking, "promise me you'll stay mortal. Promise me you'll never let them drag you into this. I promise, I said, tears streaming down my face. He nodded, then turned away. Good, he said, that's good. And then he walked into the night, his smouldering body leaving a trail of ash behind. That was the last time I saw him. Now, the world is quieter, the streets are emptier. The Eternals, or what's left of them, have started disappearing, retreating to the shadows where no one can see their suffering. The mortals, those of us who refused the pill, are left to pick up the pieces, but the scars remain. Burned buildings, empty homes, and the memory of what happens when humanity tries to conquer what it was never meant to control. I still think about Michael sometimes, about what he said. Nature always wins, and maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. It's hard to believe that it's over. A week ago, the world was a different place. People were afraid to step outside, terrified that they might catch fire or wake up one morning with their bodies crumbling to ash. The Eternals, once revered as immortals, had become little more than husks of what they once were, living, breathing reminders of a promise broken. But now, it's like nothing ever happened. The company, Vitalon, announced the antidote without warning. They'd been quiet for months, hiding behind closed doors while the world fell apart, but suddenly, out of nowhere, they came forward with a solution. A single dose of serum, they claimed, would reverse the effects of Revivex. No more burning, no more decay, no more Eternals walking the earth like walking corpses. At first no one believed it. People were skeptical, angry even, after all the lies, the suffering, and the death. How could anyone trust Vitalon again? But then a miracle happened. The first few who took the antidote started to change. The burns faded from their skin. The metallic sheen on their bodies disappeared. Their eyes returned to normal, and for the first time in months they smiled. The world didn't erupt into chaos. Instead it exhaled. I didn't take the pill. I never did. I'd seen the horror it caused, the way it twisted people into something unrecognizable. I wasn't about to risk that, no matter how many people around me were desperate for immortality. But now, as I watched the Eternals who had been ravaged by the pill begin to heal, I felt a sense of relief. Maybe there was hope after all. Michael, though, he had taken the pill. I had begged him not to, but he'd been so sure, so certain that the promise of eternal life was worth the risk. He'd gone through the worst of it, the burns, the flesh slowly peeling away, his body turning into something that no longer resembled the brother I once knew. But now, with the antidote being distributed, I saw him again. I hadn't seen Michael in weeks. After everything, I thought he was gone. But there he was, standing in front of me in the park, looking normal, whole, human again. "Aaron," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I didn't know what I was becoming. I'm sorry. I couldn't speak at first." He was back. The burns, the disfigurement, gone. His skin was normal again, his eyes no longer flickering with the eerie light that had once terrified me. He was alive, he was human again. You're okay," I said, my voice shaking. "You're really back." "I didn't know how bad it was," he continued. "The pill, it was a mistake. I didn't realize what it would do. I thought I was invincible, but I was wrong. The antidote, it worked. I'm just human again." I looked at him, relief flooding my chest. He was the brother I remembered, not the hollow shell I'd feared he'd become forever. "I'm just glad it's over," I said, finally finding my voice. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to lose you." He nodded, and for the first time in months we just stood there, taking in the moment. The world had been through hell, but we had made it out. We had survived. The antidote spread across the world, and slowly the Eternals returned.